I have a lot of, you know, big dreams for this project and am really grateful to everyone who's participated so far. So thank you. And I guess to start, um, this book, The United States, Southeast Asia and Historical Memory, is not necessarily a summer or beach read. Um, but the best time to learn is now, right? And you know, it had been a few years actually since I read this book, and so I really welcomed the opportunity to read it again. And reading chapter after chapter after chapter, it almost reads like fiction, right? Like a sci-fi about the worst and most awful actions humans can have toward one another. And the research and scholarship included in this book is dense, right? Details that have been and should continue to be studied and expanded, like how many gallons of Agent Orange were dropped, how many tons of bombs, the measurement of toxic chemicals that showed up in food, diseases that can be attributed to these chemicals, the best estimates of civilian casualties and deaths, and so much more. So tonight we have the pleasure of speaking with Mark Pavlick, editor of the book, and with so much possibility of issues and topics to discuss in this book, we're going to hear from Mark on, what it was like to compile this book, how he brought people together. I just kept thinking about how did, you narrow it down into just this book. So I want to hear more about that. And then the lessons that we can continue to learn from this. Um, and so, Mark, I know you have some remarks and things you'd like to share about some parts of this book to start, and then we can open it up for some conversation. But yeah, over to you, Mark. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to speak to Legacies of War, and it was an honor to work on this book. Can you hear me okay? I
Yes.
always okay, thank you. So very briefly about me. I was a non-academic employee at Georgetown University for many years, during which time I was a part-time student and I participated in uh, the anti-war movement. And specifically, I did volunteer work with the Indochina Resource Center, uh, which is described in the book. Several of the authors worked at the Indochina Resource Center, and also with the Vietnam education, the Indochina Mobile Education Project, which did popular education against the war in all 50 states, and which deserves a book of its own. But their headquarters was in the district, so I did some work with those people also. So after 1975, I mean, this is going to sound ridiculously protracted, but uh, anyone who lived through that period could not immediately, and who had any exposure to independent information about what had actually happened, uh, you could not help but feel, and I mean feel in your bones, the phrase of the U.S. historian of the war, Marilyn Young. She described the efforts to rewrite the history of what had actually happened as willed historical amnesia. You could not help but feel that watching what happened beginning immediately in 75 and continuing up to the present, I regret to say. Uh, yeah, and we can talk about that later. But anyway, it was having had the experiences I did, I, you know, in my usual half organized way, got this book together. I had either had personal contact or had read the work of all of these authors and activists. So uh, I had an easier time than the average person would have. It was an enormous advantage being in Washington, D.C. So, beginning with the foreword, Richard Falk and his extremely generous introduction to the book, uh, saying that the United States refuses to learn, uh, at least the people who can make a difference in policy, refuse to learn the lessons of the U.S. and Indochina. And Falk, I'm sure many of you know, himself was a participant in the anti-war movement. He visited North Vietnam, tried to, encourage talks between the U.S. and Vietnam, North Vietnam, and was quite knowledgeable about all other aspects of the war, and wrote a three-volume work on Indochina and Vietnam and international law, which was a remarkable work. So up to the present, Richard Falk is a proponent of international law and a strong United Nations, and very grateful for his generosity in writing the foreword for this book. Fred Brantman, I worked with, at both in volunteer work at the Indochina Resource Center. We also organized lectures for him at area universities in Washington. And his piece, the first in the book, War Crimes in Indochina and Our Troubled National Soul. Um, I I I can I think that his conclusions in this piece are, for me, common sense at this point. Uh, the U.S. is is kind of a sick nation in not facing the truth of what happened in Indochina and what it did in Indochina, and it will remain, you know, sick and incomplete until, as he says, it seeks the truth regarding the war and admits responsibility, seeks forgiveness, and makes amends. Uh, any American adult alive during 65, 75 bears a measure of responsibility at one level or another for the killing of Indochinese civilians. It's possible to view the wars as justified efforts to fight communism. That's maybe, but, and yet also to acknowledge our deep shame as a people at the innocent villagers this country killed. This profound wound within our national soul can only be healed if all Americans take responsibility for it. Yes, and he cites an unlikely, what you might think of as an unlikely supporter of this view, at least at first glance. Senator John McCain said in an interview, in rec after years as a captive in North Vietnam, he said he doesn't, he was asked a provocative question, what do you think about those anti-war protesters? And instead of the answer that the interviewer might have wanted, McCain said he does not blame the protesters for their lack of support for the war. I blame the lack of support on those who failed to tell the American people exactly what was going on. That led to cynicism. Uh, if I had my own failings, says McCain, if someone was wrong or if I disagreed with them, it put me in a mood rather to heal those differences rather than to take sides. I found out I wasn't as tough, as strong, or as confident as I thought I was. So Fred says at the end of this piece, if all involved could find the initiative within themselves to take similar attitudes, seeking points of reconciliation, we might be able to unite America at home and restore the faith of our young people in their leadership. Instead of remaining despised and resented around the world, a new, humbler America might find itself in a position to help forge the collective global leadership necessary to face the 21st century crises yet to come. So that's Fred Branfman. The second chapter is our short excerpts from his wonderful book, Voices of the Plain of Jars. All of the, so these are images, drawings done by Laotian peasants who suffered under American bombing, mainly in northern Laos. Uh, they were brought to Fred when he was working as a journalist and interpreter in mostly in the capital. And he collected them into a book, which was published in 72 or 73, and which has been republished by the University of Wisconsin Press uh, sometime in the last 10 years. So it's a masterpiece of a depiction of the actual life of villagers suffering under the heaviest bombing in human history, likely. And it's a tribute to Fred that he did this, that he took the time to bring all this to the general public, to the U.S. public. So that's an entire book that you should read, of course. And all the photos are on Legacies website, uh, and there's a whole story behind how the photos were. They almost became archived somewhere, but they were rescued by John Cavanagh at the Institute for Policy Studies. Anyway, the third chapter, I'm just going to make a few comments about each article because we can't. We could spend an hour or 2 hours on each article, and we cannot do that. And so I'm just going to say a few things about each article, then hopefully we can have a discussion. The third article is Chanapa Kamvongsa and Elaine Russell's overview article about the history of the West in Laos, beginning with the French colonial period. And the majority of their article is devoted to cluster bomb, the continuing problem of cluster bombs in Laos, which any member of Legacies knows more about than I do, but the enormous problems left behind by this massive amount of cluster ammunition buried beneath the ground that keeps getting exploded by passing villagers, and which is resulting up to the present in loss of life, continuing morbidity and mortality, and which uh, is being addressed to some extent, by the U.S. and by international NGOs, but which simply remains an enormous problem. It has rendered unarable large areas of Laos, and maybe Dane, you can say more about that as soon as I finish here. But anyway, Chanapa and Elaine's article, their historical overview of French colonialism in Laos, and then the U.S. intervention in Laos after the Second World War. It's masterful, well worth reading. Explains a lot. Okay. A medical researcher in Australia who is uh, from Vietnam, Tuan Nguyen, wrote a an a summary of the effects of Agent Orange in Vietnam, and there's an enormous amount of information in this article. He writes from the perspective of a a medical professional, and he discusses expertly not just sheer mortality caused by these deadly chemicals, but the continuing significant uh, occurrence of birth defects, dreadful birth defects, and other morbidity caused by the continuing presence of Agent Orange in the earth in South Vietnam, mainly in South Vietnam, and also effects on the environment. Um, it, it's a I'm and very grateful to the estate of uh, one second the British photographer Philip Jones Griffiths, who wrote he compiled he was a photographer who worked in Vietnam. He compiled 2 volumes of photos from Vietnam, both of which are well worth your time. He allowed us to use a couple photos of his from his collections of uh, infants and a malformed fetus, uh, both direct results of Agent Orange use in Vietnam. So, uh, a touchstone article. I'm very honored to have been able to bring it to light. The fifth article we're already on. Probably the world's leading expert on Cambodia, Ben Kiernan, still at Yale, I believe, and his Canadian political scientist co-author, Taylor Owen, wrote a short article about Cambodia, talking about Professor Kiernan and Taylor Owen uh, took the simple step of making freedom of information requests regarding U.S. bombing in Cambodia. You have to step back for a minute and think, wait a minute, why hadn't a journalist or someone else done that like decades before? But they took the trouble to ask for the truth about the American bombing of Cambodia. And what they learned was that the American bombing of Cambodia was at least 4 times what had been previously reported. So, massive amounts of U.S. ordnance dropped on a small country of Asian peasants over a significant period of time, and not restricted to military targets. Widespread bombing of civilian areas, agricultural areas. When President Nixon issued, uh, a later chapter of these orders, he transmitted his wishes to Henry Kissinger. Kissinger's exact words to military leaders was, uh, you know, in parentheses, utilize anything that flies on anything that moves, i.e., indiscriminate bombing. So, uh, how can any rational person think about the origins of the Khmer Rouge without considering this enormous, attack from a foreign power on innocent people? Every study of the Khmer Rouge discusses U.S. bombing as the one of the main causative factors in the rise of the Khmer Rouge. So, honored to publish Ben Kiernan and Taylor Owen's work. And uh, there's more to say about Cambodia, but maybe we can talk about that later. Uh, Gareth Porter, with whom I also worked at the Indochina Resource Center, uh, was kind enough to contribute an article about My Lai and the American way of war crimes. In a nutshell, uh, the official army study the ostensible study that was going to figure out the reasons for the My Lai massacre, uh, it was largely suppressed, and that was for careerist reasons. Uh, it it would have hurt the authors and the administrators of the study to tell the truth about My Lai being kind of a general policy of the U.S. in Vietnam, not an isolated incident, and by no means the biggest incident, you know. So, to just quoting some final words of Gareth Porter's article, uh, we don't know whether Westmoreland consulted directly with McNamara about orders regarding the treatment of the civilian population that were given to the commanders of ground combat units entering Viet Cong base areas. Nevertheless, the fact that McNamara was made aware of the consequences of the policy of denying the civilian population of Viet Cong zones the protection from air and artillery attacks required by the international laws of war, and that he expressed his enthusiastic assent to that policy in testimony before Congress provides sufficient evidence of his, McNamara's, personal responsibility for the U.S. command's strategy of treating all civilians effectively as enemy combatants. You know, that statement speaks for itself. The seventh chapter of the book is by an Indian uh, political scientist who works in Australia regarding the U.S. Covert operation, semi-covert operation in Indonesia in 1965. What about Indonesia? Indonesia was, as Noam Chomsky put it once, there was a sort of rational kernel to the domino theory. At the time, you know, many years ago, uh, mainstream commentators would kind of ridicule the simplistic version of the domino theory. Oh, do we really think the Viet Cong are coming to Philadelphia tomorrow or something like that? That's not completely honest to read policymakers as being that simple-minded. Uh, when policymakers worried about the future of countries like Cambodia, Laos, even Vietnam, they were worried about at least one major economic and political power in Southeast Asia, namely Indonesia. And they were willing to act on their assumptions regarding how important Indonesia was. And one of the actions they took to ensure the stability of Indonesia with regard to Western interests was to help with what can only be called a mass murder operation in 1965 in Indonesia. And I mean, we're not, I'm sorry to talk in generic terms. I can't go into every article in enormous detail because each article, we could spend an hour on each article. But it's well documented that the CIA was intensely involved in the 1965 coup in Indonesia, in which something like 500,000 to 1 million, mostly landless peasants, were murdered. Uh, Landless peasants who were asking for a more democratic economic system, a more democratic political system, and this was seen as those latter initiatives were not seen as being in U.S. interest. So those persons were eliminated with extensive help from the CIA. I mean, I'm talking about lists of people to be murdered being supplied by the CIA, all documented by reliable journalists. And there are, of course, there are entire books, book-length accounts of these events. Some of the most important by George McKayen at Cornell University, founder of the Southeast Asia Studies program there. And so there's more to be said about the domino theory. We can talk about it later. Chapter 8, so many people died. The American System of Suffering, 1965, 2014. Nick Turse is an independent U.S. journalist. He has an entire book on counterinsurgency policy in Vietnam, titled Kill Anything That Moves. I think that was Pantheon Press. And this is just his contribution here is just one chapter from his book, and it's the story of some indiscriminate massacres in Vietnam. At the end, he interviews an elderly Vietnamese man and uh, said to him, "I what would you ask of the average American if you had a chance to speak directly to them?" The elderly Vietnamese man said, "If the American people knew about these kinds of incidents, if they learn about the wartime suffering of people in Vietnam, do you think they will be uh, sympathetic? Do you think they'll sympathize?" Finally know the answer to this question. And we can talk about Nick Turse's book later if you want. The ninth chapter of this book is Bloodbaths in Indochina, Constructive, Nefarious, and Mythical. This is an excerpt from Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's two-volume book, The Political Economy of Human Rights, which was published in 1979. It's a chapter looking at kind of a typology of uh, war crimes and crimes against humanity in Vietnam. And it's a useful typology. There are, it depends on whose whose responsibility we're looking at. When we do dreadful things or our allies, they're either benign or even constructive events. So for example, the Diem regime in South Vietnam, completely constructed by the United States, and given a wonderful gloss by the press in this country. A very repressive regime, involved mass elimination of political dissidents. Diem learned the art of using the guillotine from the French and the French period. And uh, no one reads today unless you go to, scholarly works about Diem having murdered tens of thousands of people who opposed his government. He was presented in this country as this wonderful reformer and religious and all of this sort of thing. But so his own, as it were, bloodbaths were in the benign category, maybe even constructive. Uh, so what about nefarious bloodbaths? Well, those are things the enemy does. Of course they exist. Of course they happened. The element of revenge exists in human beings. You should ask yourself, how would you react if you saw family members being murdered for no reason, you know, which is what people in these countries did observe often in real life. So I can't do justice to uh, all the material in this chapter in a matter of minutes. It should go without saying that that entire book by Chomsky and Herman, The Political Economy of Human Rights, well worth your time. It surveys the whole world, mainly in the post-war period, post-World War II period, but it goes beyond that. And very profound book, in my opinion. Chapter 10, From Mad Jack to Mad Henry, the US and Vietnam. So I was doing work with the Indochina Resource Center and a Vietnamese, two Vietnamese nationals, David Trung and Fred Branfman's wife, Thoa Nguyen, uh, were making efforts to reach out to the Vietnamese diaspora community in the United States after 1975. So they published a magazine titled Bridge, and this tiny journal for in half in English, half in Vietnamese for the Vietnamese diaspora community. And I'm helping with this distribute copies of this journal, and suddenly I see this article by Noam Chomsky, which is I think every American should read this article. It's a comprehensive review of the U.S. and Vietnam, uh, beginning from uh, a an attack by the U.S. Navy nearly a century ago, through U.S. support for in post-World War II, the U.S. leadership was supportive of those elements in the Fourth Republic in France who thought that uh, their country, as part of Reconstruction after World War II, their country required uh, a reconstitution of its empire, and that had to include Indochina. So, uh, important to emphasize something Daniel Ellsberg pointed out. It's not really correct to call it the French War. There would not have been a French War without massive U.S. support. In that period, in the up through Dien Bien Phu, 1954, the U.S. had a huge interest in rebuilding Europe in a certain way. And part of that vision was reconstitution of the empire for France. And to a lesser extent, the other former imperial powers like Great Britain. So uh, this review article uh, of Chomsky's from 1975 goes through all that, and then it reviews the entirety of the U.S. and Vietnam after 1954. John Foster Dulles' refusal to recognize the Geneva Accords, and all of the actions that happened after that, all of the U.S. intervention. And it's a short article. It's a masterpiece, in my opinion. Very grateful to have been able to publish it. Chapter 11, No Van Long, Vietnamese scholar. His degree was from John Fairbank at Harvard. Uh, Wrote a kind of sequel to the article I just described by Noam Chomsky. So after 1975, and Long's article describes continuing U.S. hostility towards Vietnam after 75, which included, dreadful economic sanctions, uh, including all forms of humanitarian assistance, um, up through uh, via Zbigniew Brzezinski's support for a kind of a massive retaliation raid by China in 1975, invading parts of northern Vietnam and murdering thousands of people because uh, there's a quote from a journalist here. Uh, I don't want to read the whole thing, but bilateral military ties can be expected to continue growing, but progress will be slow. Vietnam will value America's role as strategic balance, but will resist being seen as part of a containment policy against China. American policymakers understand and accept this line, as the U.S. has no containment policy against China. Hedging is not containment. Uh, Vietnam will keep looking over its shoulder to ensure that Big Brother China has not been unduly provoked. Vietnam-U.S. ties should progress. Our two countries have no strategic conflicts, some important areas of strategic convergence. Uh, so the U.S. and Vietnam could find some sort of productive relationship, but why? Because Long ends by saying, what is strategic convergence not why is it now seen in a less threatening way than it was seen in 1965? Is it because the United States has realized that it has successfully eliminated the primary threat of, quotes, communism, as defined back in the early 60s and as quoted by Chomsky? Give me 1 second. I want to go back to uh, an important quote here. Uh, no, excuse me. 1 second. I'm sorry, I should have bookmarked this page. Oh, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. This is Chomsky quoting a study group sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation and the National Planning Association sometime in the early 60s once defined the primary threat of, quotes, communism as the economic transformation of non-Western powers in, quotes, ways which reduce their willingness and ability to complement the industrial economies of the West. So in a nutshell, American hegemony in the West was naturally assumed. This comment is accurate and astute. The United States is the dominant power in the global capitalist system, otherwise known as the free world, and it will use what means it can muster to counter any move towards independence that will tend to reduce this willingness and ability to complement the industrial economies of the West. Yes. So what No Van Long is saying is Vietnam as a counterexample of independent development, it was effectively eliminated. And what remains is up to the present still a scarred country which cannot possibly act in a completely independent way and cannot fail to complement Western economies. So there's a lot to be said about all that, of course. And we can go on, talk about it later. Chapter 12, my interview with Fred Branfman. Fred describes growing up on Long Island, uh, going to college, getting a degree in education at Harvard, being involved in the peace movement, uh, having to argue with his draft board on Long Island, initially being sent to Tanganyika, and then ending up in Laos, where he learned the language, studied, read, uh, observed everything with a critical eye, um, including the American presence there. And he describes feeling alienated from the U.S. mission, as such as it was in Laos, and seeing it as corrupt, incompetent, uh, exploitative, and opposed to the interests of the average Laotian. So he comments on the anti-war movement. He comments on the future of Laos. There's a lot in his interview. It was a tremendous privilege to know Fred and to work with him and to publish this interview. The end of the book is an interview with Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky talks about international law. Uh, all of these interventions of the U.S. in Southeast Asia were enormous violations of all aspects of international law. He talks about the book we were talking about earlier, The Political Economy of Human Rights. Uh, he says no one has ever provided anything demonstrating any major factual error in that two-volume work. He talks about even then, and as I say, it began immediately in 1975 and continues up to the present. The effort to rewrite all this history, the active effort to rewrite all this history. There are individual historians working full time at producing counter histories of uh, the sort of work that we've been talking about here, uh, justifying all of this, glossing over all of this. I'm sure with regard to Laos too. Um, and uh, he talks about Cambodia and East Timor and what we can learn from he and Edward Herman's lengthy analogy between those two situations. Something I wanted to make sure to mention here. He talks about the anti-war movement, and he talks about the empirical fact that much of the anti-war movement was very staid and conservative. It stayed within uh, mainstream parameters of discussion. Uh, it was it was a minority of even the anti-war movement that it challenged basic assumptions of U.S. foreign policy, basic readings of U.S. history. So if you don't mind, I don't want this whole session to be, a terrible psychological burden. Uh, Chomsky says there are hopeful lessons regarding the anti-war movement too. Popular opposition to the war did not keep to the paradigm of a mistake based on good intentions. By 1979, over two-thirds of the population described the war as, quotes, not a mistake, but rather, quotes, fundamentally wrong and immoral. Those figures remain pretty constant up to the most recent polls in which the relevant questions were asked a few years ago. Exactly what people meant by these statements, we don't know with confidence because the right follow-up questions were not asked. But the results are nevertheless rather striking, particularly because people who express these views are unlikely to have seen or heard them in the mainstream. And that regrettably remains true also up to the present. Opposition to aggression is only one of the legacies of the activism of the 60s and its aftermath. It's common to hear concerns these days about the lack of protest against, this is 2008, the lack of protest against the Iraq War as it compared with the Vietnam protests. The comparisons, however, are misleading. At a period of the Vietnam War comparable to Iraq today, there was virtually no protest. Or take the question of withdrawal. In the case of Iraq, it's a lively topic. By contrast, the first call for withdrawal from Vietnam that I can recall in the US mainstream, was in the fall of 1969 in a Boston Globe editorial. Simply compare the scale of the Indochina wars at that time and Iraq today. One important lesson of the activism of the 60s is that activism can make a difference, a lasting one, and can lead to changes of consciousness to be carried forward in the future. In many respects, the country has become a more civilized place thanks to the activism of the 60s and, and its expansion in many directions in the years that followed. There's a glossary of selected terms for the book. By the way, any all credit for any organization in this book belongs to uh, uh, Haymarket's wonderful uh, editor, my colleague Caroline Luft. So please be aware of that. The list of organizations for further action, that was a collective endeavor, and I sincerely hope Legacies is in there. Yes, and uh, recommended reading. Very grateful to a number of people for reading suggestions. Number one, Marjorie Cohen, who's a professor of international law at University of California, San Diego, if I remember right, and Richard Falk, both contributed a great list of primary documents in international law uh, and commentaries on these subjects by important authors. So very much worth mentioning among all of these great books, but I think a special mention for Telford Taylor's book, which was a big, uh, huge discussion when it appeared, 1970, Nuremberg and Vietnam, an American Tragedy. Telford Taylor was one of the lead prosecutor. Telford Taylor himself was one of the lead prosecutors at Nuremberg. He's not, you know, some unimportant newcomer to the field. He was a prosecutor at Nuremberg, and he himself saw very troubling analogies between U.S. policy in Southeast Asia and the crimes that we indicted the Nazis and others for at Nuremberg. So uh, that's a very noteworthy book. They're all noteworthy books. I'm very grateful for that appendix from those two scholars of international law. I contributed a few suggestions here. Th these are all noteworthy works and kind of obvious to anyone that was around at that time. Dr. Nguyen was kind enough to contribute a whole list of books on Vietnam and U.S. policy, including many of the most important books on Agent Orange. Uh, Noam Chomsky helped me with this book throughout its its getting it together, and uh, profoundly miss him. He had a major stroke. We're probably not going to hear from him again, but he was always there. He spoke widely uh, in this period, usually for nothing, and his own works on the U.S. and Vietnam and Indochina and on U.S. policy generally, their importance can't be overestimated, in my opinion. So I have other things to mention, but why don't we hear what your thoughts are before I mention anything else?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Mark. This is a beautiful overview and will be a wonderful accompaniment for anyone that reads the book. Um, there's so much, like you said, there's so much in this book. It's really like it can act sort of as like a reference, right? And in my work, what I see, like with Legacies, I speak with people that maybe don't know much about this history all the time, right? And like Kat, I think I have, maybe 30 to 60 seconds before, eyes maybe start to glaze over because And I
Hmm.
don't think it's because of like a lack of interest. I think it's just because it's so hard to comprehend that, these numbers are so massive and the atrocities are so horrible. And also that we're just continuing to see it. I don't know if we've become sort of desensitized, but um, I loved what Nick Turse said. I loved his chapter. Like I was pulled right in like to his writing, and I haven't read his book, but I'm going to. But he said, I listened intently as I had so many times before to so many similar stories, but it was still beyond my ability to comprehend. It's probably beyond yours too. So I'm curious, Mark, when you reflect on the significance of this book and its contributions to the dialogue, and study of this history, what do you believe are the main themes and lessons to be learned?
Uh, uh, Honesty regarding history. I mean, history should be an empirical study, and it is for, genuinely competent historians. And we should apply the same standards to ourselves with regard to our history as Americans that we might apply to other countries. As Chomsky has said in many contexts, if we look at the history of the former Soviet Union, it's not very hard to find things to condemn. We can see the facts clearly. We can clearly see the facts of aggressive and various major human rights violations by China. We can, getting closer to home, even look at some of our cousins in Western Europe and condemn retrospectively, for the most part, their adventures outside of their borders and harm that they cause to other peoples. We have to be honest and use the same standards for ourselves. I mean, that's all this book is an attempt to do. And I mean, the authors that contributed to this book, by the way, no one made it, in case you had any doubts, no one made any money off this book. And whatever proceeds there were have been donated to Legacies. No author asked for anything in return for their contribution. This was all a pro bono effort. And but all of these contributors feel the same way regarding U.S. history and U.S. policy. Uh, we're talking about the real world. This is all objective information. We can't wish that it weren't so, you know, and we can't rewrite it, regrettably, Uh, we have to deal with we have to deal honestly with the implications of this information. So um, there are there was something else by Fred Branfman I wanted to mention. Unless I don't want to take time away from anybody else. If
No,
anybody
of
else
course,
has
of
anything they want to
course.
say, but
Yeah.
a piece of Fred Branfman's that Alfred McCoy mentioned at your meeting, your wonderful seminar regarding all of the work of Fred Branfman. I had to go to the library and look it up. So a book that was published in 1970, titled Laos, War and Revolution, edited by Nina Adams and Alfred McCoy, which is a wonderful book in general. I regret I didn't read it at the time. I ordered an out of print copy of it today. But Fred Branfman has a significant piece in this book titled Presidential War in Laos, 1964 through 1970. Uh, a very important piece that Alfred McCoy described very well last time. Fred makes the important point that future U.S. interventions in the world, and this is writing in 1970, will be more like Laos than Vietnam. What does he mean by this? He means the most important factor being the U.S. learned in Vietnam, as opposed to, and applied this lesson in Laos almost immediately. Uh, I like the phrase, the kind of blunt phrasing by Noam Chomsky for this point. You can't fight a colonial war or a neo-colonial war with conscripts. And what does that mean? Look at the history of draft resistance with regard to the Vietnam War. And above and beyond draft resistance, look at the actual performance of U.S. draftees in Vietnam. It's a very mixed picture, and that's a positive reflection on American young men. Uh, you can't uh, you can't take an ordinary person and convert them into a counterinsurgency uh, combatant uh, so easily. In many cases, it's a complete failure. In other cases, maybe the person functions for a while, but they end up with PTSD and they are a human wreckage the rest of their life. It's 8 o'clock. Yeah, okay. So uh, that is also what Fred Brantman says with regards to Laos. The U.S. learned that a massive air war directed above all at the destruction of a physical setting and the social infrastructure of the enemy, a ground war fought by Asian troops, directed and supplied by a relatively small number of American personnel, large-scale evacuation of the civilian population to American-controlled zones, the creation of an American-directed civil administration paralleling the existing government structure, the Royal Lao government in this case, and a policy of deliberate secrecy designed to give the executive as free a hand as possible in doing all these things. Yeah, that's the US and Laos. And uh, if you don't mind, I want to expand a little bit on the point the first point. Uh, by analogy, I mean, these are not US specific observations about human nature. Uh, uh, the whole process of what is termed decolonization in academia was often a very bloody and dreadful series of events for everybody concerned. Certainly, for example, France in Algeria, similar, again, analogously to the leaders of the Fourth Republic in France's feeling that France could not be a great nation and a great economy unless it reconstituted its empire. Uh, French leaders disregarded the wishes of, among multiple examples, the people of Algeria for freedom. So uh, instead of negotiating or coming to some agreement, the leaders of France in that period decided on a hard line. They would simply militarily repress efforts at independence, and that would require a conscript army, quite like the U.S. in Indochina. And what about that conscript army? Was this a straightforward uh, enterprise? Were there no problems with conscripts performing this function? No, the opposite. There were enormous problems. And just one im interesting perspective on this. Uh, the famous French director Alain Resnais made a movie, I don't know, in the 60s sometime titled Muriel, the woman's name. So who was Muriel? The story is about a young man who returns from Algeria, but instead of jumping back into civilian life, he's suffering what we would call today PTSD. He stays at home walking around muttering this woman's name, Muriel. And his mother says, "Who is this anyway? Some girlfriend or something?" Uh, no, Muriel was an Algerian uh, independence fighter whose torture and murder he directly observed, maybe participated in, and as part of this French mission to retake this colony. And he was driven crazy by this, and he was is not depicted as a normal person in this movie. So an interesting just kind of footnote, but I don't think I'm going off on too much of a tangent. Uh, a young graduate student in history in this period named Raphael Branche saw this movie and said, "This is what I want to do my doctoral thesis on." So she produced a tremendous book about how the French army trained conscripts to torture people, not a part of anyone's, elementary and secondary education. And how did this go? What were the problems? Of course, it was a nightmare. The whole thing was a nightmare. And however, it's a credit that there was opposition to all this. And you can't convert most ordinary people into people who commit war crimes, people who do terrible things. And that's a credit to those individuals. So I don't know. Anyway, so the themes, I don't see the themes of this book as being absolutely unique. There are parallels with other world events, unfortunately. So anyway, I'm sorry to go off on a tangent like that, but Fred is touching on these themes too in this important piece of his of 50 years ago. The U.S. looking at Vietnam realized it couldn't do the same thing in Laos. Could not conscript young men to go forcibly dominate a country of Asian peasants. Another reference I want to give regarding the anti-war movement is a fairly recent book by the historian Carolyn Eisenberg. Her book is titled Fire and Rain. It's mostly about Nixon and Kissinger. And again, on the basis of a lot of empirical research, Carolyn, who herself was a participant in the anti-war movement, demonstrates that uh, in different ways, the anti-war movement did have an effect on U.S. policy at multiple levels. One important effect of the anti-war movement was to delegitimize the whole Indochina effort so that ordinary families in the Midwest and elsewhere did not want their sons going to Vietnam. And this had a direct effect on the person who was Secretary of Defense during the Nixon-Kissinger period, Melvin Laird. He had been a congressman from Wisconsin, and he knew what it was to hear from constituents. And those constituents they did not want their sons being sent to this at best ambiguous conflict. And if they were already there, they wanted their sons brought back. And Melvin Laird, as Secretary of Defense, did bring them back. And this diminution, increasing incremental diminution of the U.S. Forces in Vietnam, especially, uh, tied Nixon's hands. Hence the the kind of exaggerated emphasis on aerial bombing. The U.S. couldn't do what it wanted to on the ground for all of these reasons that we've talked about, but including uh, just the gradually decreasing ground force and regarding other efforts of the anti-war movement, a decreasing budget that Nixon couldn't do anything about. Congress got to the point where, because of what it was hearing from constituents, it would not fund this effort anymore. And that is another major lesson of the anti-war movement and of the whole period. I'm going to put I work also with a group that is cons putting together a series of webinars like this one on the history of the anti-war movement. And they have a wonderful YouTube series on various topics that we've discussed here. And I'm going to put the link in the chat here. Excuse me. So go, I'm sorry, I'm going to shut up. Go ahead.
No, please don't. No, it was so wonderful. Thank you for the overview. And I think making the connections, zooming out, looking at, connecting this to other countries, other conflicts is so important because it also connects us. And, um, what Chanapa and Elaine did in their chapter and what we hope to do with our timeline on our website is to show how the escalation of how something like this could happen. And so talking about Laos as as a kingdom and giving that context is really important. Um, does anyone have any questions for Mark?
Hi. Hi. This may
Hi.
be kind of far. This may be kind of far out, but I'm wondering with the current at the opposite end of the political spectrum, there's a lot of anti-war feeling also right now. Is there how do you
I,
understand that?
I wish I knew more about it. I do know, I mean, I know something about it, but yes, it's interesting to observe um, uh, opposition to Trump's adventures in Iraq with with Iran, coming from uh, what's his name, the bow-tied right-wing commentator. I I can't, but various people on the American
Yeah,
right.
yeah, it's more
Yes.
than one. Yeah.
Uh, are they opposing it on the basis of international law or?
I think it's more isolationism. That's kind of
Uh-huh.
how I view it, but it's interesting that it's coming from that end of the spectrum also right now.
I wish it would lead to something. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. It prompted by the July 4th president's speech on the mall, which I ended up watching because the weather was very dicey in DC. And sorry if this is a left fielder, but I was watching how he was honoring various military positions, etc. And Danae, I don't know if you know this, but Sharon, Rebecca Rush's sister, walked out on stage. Like I'm just like minding my own business, and I see Sharon enter the stage. And Sharon and Rebecca lost their father during the war. And Rebecca is a cyclist, and she cycled to the point of which her father's crash point was in Laos. Why am I bringing this up at all is I thought, well, they're recognizing a soldier who was in Laos, and I don't know. My question is do we feel like there's more transparency now, or what does transparency look like now that we're beyond 50 years from the war? I'm just curious your reaction to that.
Do we, is information more available now regarding, by analogy, what the US is really doing in Iran as opposed to 50 years ago in Indochina? I'd rather hear someone else comment on that, but I'm not so sure it's so much more transparent personally. But what do other people think? I don't want to hog all the time here.
Go
Yeah.
ahead, Janet.
Well, I'm old enough to remember. I'm almost 80. And so I was at college and grad school during those years. I think that what's interesting about the Trump years now is that it's being normalized. We still aren't getting an in-depth picture of all the terrible atrocities and the strategies, and especially the role of multinational corporations and finance in this. But I think what I remember from my youth is that everyone was horrified, horrified. And the words from, and even the, we had the media, we had 3 channels, that's all we had. We all heard the same thing. It's a very different thing now. We have multiple voices talking at once, no one's listening. And the administration is saying, it's sort of shocking to me. The administration is taking pride in doing all the things that we found out that were horrible and were reprehensible. But the administration today is taking pride in this behavior, like these internment camps that we have for immigrants and all this other stuff. They're so proud of it. So even Abu Ghraib was something that we were a little bit embarrassed about during those years. But no, there's no embarrassment coming from the top anymore. So I think that's a big difference.
I
I don't
have
know if that.
one thought came to me about the current sort of anti-war thing. It comes more from isolationism rather than from care for other people or for the impact of this war on other people. It's more about protecting ourselves. I mean, that's the uh, I think where the current anti-war thing comes from is um, more of a more self-centered and selfish perspective than was the case, against the other foreign adventurers.
There doesn't seem to be any more respect for international law than there was many years ago. If anything, you know, Trump talking about, or was it JD Vance talking about attacking? Oh, no, excuse me. It was Marco Rubio saying, we're going to go after the International Court of Justice. Uh, you know, Trump openly talking about we're deliberately targeting civilian targets, as if that was a new step. Previously we were holding back, you know, presumably attacking only military targets, but now we're openly and deliberately attacking civilian targets in Iran. Oh, okay. The deliberate targeting of civilians is a war crime under all of international law. I mean, that's the most basic distinction. So,
Yeah, thanks everybody for sharing your thoughts. As I was putting together some questions for tonight, um, my phone buzzed and it was from the New York Times, like just sends me emails right when there's breaking news. And I'm writing these questions about the war and the cost, and it says breaking news: cost of Iran war has reached 37.5 billion. Um, Pete Hegseth is requesting an additional 80 billion, and I'm just like, totally disoriented, right? Um, and I always go back to Ben Kiernan and Taylor Owens' um, work on Cambodia. And I loved what they said in this book when they said, what we did in Southeast Asia set a troubling precedent. And I really appreciate that framing of these wars setting a troubling precedent for what a government can do both publicly and privately. The conversation between Nixon and Kissinger that you mentioned is so haunting to me. And that quote that there's no limitation on budget and no limitation on mileage. Um,
Right.
and just that part, I think about how powerful those same words could be if they were used talking about providing aid and support to our fellow humans. And, but we know that those words are meant to define a method of bombardment. I also appreciated the authors that ended their chapters with recommendations and suggestions for the US to take. And in the last week, we had a book discussion on this, and we talked about, Fred Bramfin references what Germany did and how they've reckoned as a nation,
Mm.
um, and even the Holocaust Museum that's in DC, and I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the US can, even today, reckon with what we did in Southeast Asia as a nation.
I don't think I can do better than Fred Branchman. As
Yeah,
I quoted towards the end of his article, he said, in general terms, he said, be honest and admit admit the truth of what happened. Seek the truth,
yeah,
admit responsibility, seek forgiveness, make amends. And I think he's right that this will not be a normal country until
mhm,
we do these things. Uh, for all you Kissinger fans out there, I had another quote. He outdoes himself, or did outdo himself towards the end of his life. Years later, asked about his role in Cambodia, Kissinger professed himself baffled that anybody could question him about what he had done. And so the direct quote is, I may have a lack of imagination, but I fail to see the moral issue involved. That's Kissinger. Uh, Others have more imagination. The deposed king of Cambodia, Norodom Sihanouk, blamed Kissinger and Nixon squarely for the rise of the Khmer Rouge, saying the only two men responsible for the tragedy in Cambodia were Nixon and Kissinger, who, quotes, created the Khmer Rouge. Okay, that's the former king of Cambodia.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. No, I think you're
some
right. And one of my questions to ask you was if you were to write this book today, how would it be different? Um, but I think what I've learned from people that have been advocates and have spent years on like producing scholarship on this is that, that what you said about honesty, and it's really repeating a lot of the same things over and over and over again, right? Like we could republish this and it would still be so true today. And even the chapter about UXO, like very little of those stats have changed since this was published.
Do you
And
remember? Do you remember the statement Susan Hammond made at? I think she spoke briefly during the Fred Brantman seminar. She said she's always working with numbers and statistics. She
mhm.
said the total amount that's been spent on reconstruction in Laos up to the present is barely the the amount of 1 day's expenditure on bombing. It was something like that. I
Yeah, I
may have,
think it was 2 days, maybe.
okay, 2 days.
Yeah,
But think about that,
yeah, I know.
and and the whole idea that all of these wonderful efforts by admirable people
Yeah.
up to the present kind of amount to 1% of the total amount of cluster bombs and other destruction done in Laos.
Mhm.
This is unthinkable.
Mhm.
How do we think? How do we make sense of this? I don't know. It's beyond belief.
And I think the frustrating part is that it takes time, right? It takes time to turn turn the ship around and go the other way. Um, I really appreciated the interview that you did with Fred so much, especially because you started by asking about his early life. And that's how we craft our interviews with for our podcast. And some people are like, you want to know about my childhood? Um, and don't really see the relevance, but it's so relevant. And I loved what it brought out from Fred. It was that he talked about his mother and how her interest, I underlined a few things. My mother had a particularly strong political and social conscience. He has a vivid memory of watching her weeping. Um,
When Adlai Stevenson lost her.
yes.
Yes, right.
And she talked about politics, and he knew that she cared about the poor and supported civil rights. And so maybe it's just me as a mom of two young kids, but it helps give me a little bit of hope that there is, that we can invest in the new generation that is more aware and more ready to be responsible and react to what we've done. So that I really enjoyed that part of the interview.
Absolutely. No, very important. He could have had an easy life. He could have decided to do something else. And he really delved into what was going on in Laos and, barely made a living doing it, right? Um, another little uh, vignette in his interview I wanted to remember to mention. So I guess this was in the early to mid 70s when he was in Vientiane, working with other journalists as an interpreter and, I don't know, doing his own work. He would be like a guide for visiting Americans, American journalists, and others. And among the things he would show them, he would bring them to these refugee camps where people fleeing the bombing in the north of the country would be, thrown together into these makeshift camps. And he says in the interview, and I remember him mentioning it in person, uh, only two people, these peasants torn from their villages by violence, right? Uh, Two people who he brought on these tours wept when they saw these refugee peasants in Vientiane, and those were a journalist, Flora Lewis. I'm going to put her Wikipedia profile in the chat. A female journalist, Flora Lewis, a important journalist for that period. And the other one was Noam Chomsky. So let me put that in the
I
chat.
was so surprised when he listed all the journalists that he translated for that
Uh-huh.
were there speaking to refugees in Laos. And I guess it was just surprising that there
How
were so
many of
many
them
there.
actually did anything after they got back? It wasn't everybody that actually did something
Hmm.
about what they learned there, you know. But no, some people did. Flora Lewis was one,
Hmm.
for sure. And T.D. Allman, uh, and others, uh, other non-American journalists. There was what's his name? A very important Indian journalist, and he teaches in India. And I should I should have had his book right next to me. I can't remember right now, but others for sure. The Far Eastern Economic Review did, you know, kind of insane that you would have to rely on a non-US, primarily economics journal for reliable reporting on events in Southeast Asia. But I can remember back to that period that was the case. That
Hmm.
the Far Eastern Economic Review was doing. I think they published T.D. Allman. They published this Indian person. I'm sorry, I don't remember right now. But you know, why not the New York Times? Why not the Washington Post? No, that would be too much. So
Yeah.
I put some references in the chat. I mean, I hope
Yes,
some
thank
of these
you.
are useful. Uh, some of the references in the uh, the uh, uh, very important. So worth mentioning, you know, again, the positive side of the anti-war movement. Uh, People studying Asia, you know, scholars studying Asia, American scholars studying Asia in this period certainly were not united in support of US administration goals. They knew Asia, they knew the peoples, they did not support US policy. So, I mean, it's history that you can read, this history of this institution. You can read about it. It's a credit to those individuals that at one point, uh, the younger, especially younger, but not only younger, Asia scholars split off from the main Asia Studies Association and formed in that period what was known as the Committee of Concerned Asia Scholars. They
Hmm.
founded their own journal and they published books, uh, very critical books, which were widely available and which did have an impact. Uh, and some of those are in the bibliography and in the appendices. And that journal, so then sometime in the 80s, the I can imagine economics being a factor too, but the kind of splinter group of dissident Asia scholars decided it was more worthwhile to uh, reform with the parent organization, but to maintain their separate journal. So I put that separate journal in the chat here. It's called the Critical Asia Studies. They continue to publish uh, great stuff, critical of U.S. and other Western, uh, great power policy in Asia and critical scholarship in general about Asian countries, Asian people. and I haven't made a big point of it, but I'm sure there's lots of stuff on Laos there.
Yeah, I mean, it's familiar to me, but I'll thank you for sharing this because I need to look into this again.
I hope I'm not putting everybody else to sleep here. Does anybody else have anything to
Not
say?
at all. Not at all.
No. Were there any other questions or thoughts from the group? Yes, yes, yes. Just go ahead.
So I just wanted to say to Mr. Pavlick how wonderful this endeavor is as an act of public history or of popular education. It's really remarkable that you put this together because you're so modest in the back of the book where it describes the contributors. You just said, "Oh, I'm an editor," but I think that that it would be nice to have a fuller description of how you decided to do this kind of work. Because
Yes.
this is the kind of work that popular education really thrives on, of bringing together disparate people and finding a different audience, a broader audience. So, could you say a little bit more about that?
Again, I just want to quote Marilyn Young, whose own books on Vietnam, the U.S. and Vietnam, are very important, well worth reading for their own sake. Uh, she was a professional historian. She had to deal with all of these various efforts coming from various directions at obliterating this history, at rewriting this history, at uh, reassigning blame, with regard to all of this history. She called it, again, willed historical amnesia. You can see it even in professional proceedings of historians these days. There are people who make a living uh, coming up with counter narratives to all of the things we were just talking about. You know, the North Vietnamese, they were clever. I heard this at I won't quote the person's name, but there's a person actively at work on rewriting the whole history of ground operations in Vietnam. Well, really, from the perspective of 2026, the real problem, which I have identified and which has evaded everyone, everybody, all other observers, the North Vietnamese were actually really good soldiers. And that's the answer to why the whole thing fell apart. Not the war aims or God knows any number of other things like the things we've talked about. No, it's that factor. And, you're welcome. But there are simply there's you can get it on Amazon. Even a person who has done good work elsewhere, Ken Burns and his what are they, PBS specials on the Civil War and things like this. He would not talk to representatives of the anti-war movement. I mean, I know this from personal friends. He can he I'm sure I haven't watched it. I'm sure it's more benign than analogous efforts, but he still would not talk about uh, simple facts about the U.S. support of the French attempt to recolonize Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Uh, John Foster Dulles refusing to honor international law at Geneva. All of the subsequent U.S. attempts at implanting puppet governments in South Vietnam, you know, and everything else. He would not deal Ken Burns would not deal with these basic considerations. What do you say about that? Millions of people watch these things, and they think, well, he's an eminent person. He must be telling the truth. No, he's evading basic literature on the subject, and also people who could tell him about it. He was offered meetings with members, people more important than me, full-time people who devoted their lives to the anti-war movement. He wouldn't talk with them. Okay, what is this? Like, cinema, you know, I'm not sure any of these movies about Indochina are accurate to depict any of the things we were talking about tonight. What do you say about these people? There's no money, likely there's no money in making movies about uh, the US propping up corrupt governments for its own interests and calling them, independent democratic governments. Who's going to make a movie about that, right? I'm not, I said enough, but I think you get the idea, right? It's a
Thank you.
shame. It's a shame, what goes on in academia is important. Fortunately, some things are different there. Publishing is important. At least the books can still be published that tell the truth. So,
Yeah.
it's not a, black and white situation, but still, you do meet young people completely misinformed about all of these issues, regrettably. So,
Yeah. And I
anybody?
think sometimes
Anybody?
that's maybe more intentional than others. I know growing up with someone that um, lived through it, I still feel somewhat misinformed. And I think many people like me do. So yeah, it just again takes time and effort. And I think to speak to the donations from this book to Legacies and the contribution that this book has had on our work, um, it propels the stories of those that survived and lived through these wars, inclusive of, veterans, diaspora, and all the above. And so we continue to, do that truth telling and seek, the honesty that is required of reckoning as a nation through the storytelling, um, you know, in our work on our website, when we speak at different events, we're usually the only ones, telling that human story. And a wonderful project we're working on right now focuses on 3 villages in Xinjiang province. That's where the Plain of Jars are, right? 3 villages, and we have all this data. We have the U.S. bombing records. Um, we have confirmed hazardous areas that have been surveyed um, by the Mines Advisory Group. And then we've conducted interviews, intergenerational interviews about getting a clear generational impact of UXO on a village over time. And, so many of these numbers are so difficult to comprehend. And so what our hope is with this project is that we can show 3 villages, 3 communities, and how they're still living with it today, and to really show like this is how many bombs were dropped on this village. One specifically, we just kind of calculated that it was bombed 2.5 times. Every inch of this village could have been bombed 2.5 times over. Um, and still in these 3 villages, more is left uncleared than is cleared. 30 years after the US has been funding. So really hoping to give a better idea of how these legacies still live on. Um, so, this work is definitely given us a strong foundation to continue that research, and I hope encourages others to do the same.
That's great.
Yeah.
Are there any sort of sister city arrangements between, like some of these villages in Laos and U.S. towns or cities? I'm just curious.
Yes, no, that's so funny you brought that up. We were just looking at that recently, and I think there are a couple. Um, I don't know off the top of my head, but I believe there are at least a couple. Not of villages, but cities. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah,
Yes,
I'll have to
Janet.
learn more about that.
Well, this is not exactly a sister city, but it's certainly my primary interest as a labor historian has been war and the impact of war on the people who are building the weapons and how
Mm.
many lives are lost during the industrial speed up. I wrote about World War II and coal miners and
Oh my goodness.
I, and it's unpublished because that's not something anybody wants to hire you if you're writing about bad things that the
Someone will
coal
publish it.
industry did. So what's interesting is that the death toll, according to some of the statistics I found, on among workers in the factories in the war industries was very high,
Mm.
very, very high, and rivaled the casualties
Oh my
of
goodness.
overseas. But you don't hear about that. And so in terms of sister cities, I was thinking about a couple of things. One is there's a scholar named Edmund Russell. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a historian of science. And he wrote
Mm.
a book called War and Nature, which is
Mm.
about the development of poison gases during World War One and how after World War One, industry decided to use those same poison gases on crops.
Oh, jeez.
And so we're living with this legacy in our world now. We're living with the legacy of war industries on how we conduct agriculture globally in the developed world. So that's one thing. And then the other thing are we had somebody from our congregation who recently went to Palestine and she stayed in the home of a person whose son had been killed by a mortar and he still had it. It was in the house. And it was
Mm.
made in Pennsylvania, which is where we live.
Oh
And so
God.
there is the difficult conversation is people are making these weapons and this is their livelihood. And so, but they are also getting sick. And people who make Agent Orange,
Oh.
who make these chemicals, are very sick. And so I think that's people have done a lot of research, more documentary films, but not as much, not as deeply as the kind of research that you've presented here, partly because the people who are doing that kind of work are filmmakers and activists, and they're not well funded, and they're also not given a platform that's large. So my thought is you really inspired me to think about. I've just about given up. I was like everything. Marilyn Young was on my PhD committee at NYU, so she's
Oh
been
my
an
goodness.
inspiration. And I didn't study the Vietnam War, but she was
Absolutely.
on my dissertation committee, and she was very um, she saw things that I probably didn't see at the same time. But I think that in order for us to really have a peace movement in the world, we have to have people see themselves in it, see how we're all affected by this. And it can't just be, this reminds me of the abolitionists, the moral argument. It can't just be a moral argument. It has to be a material argument too, I think. So I would love to talk to people more about that if anybody wants to
Certainly.
do that later.
For sure. Someone will publish your research. It sounds very important, and there are lots of publishers. You should just keep trying. There are people publishing on, in fact, Pennsylvania coal miners.
Right.
Certainly.
Well, I think that um, yeah, I just need to. I've become inspired again. I just went and did a bunch of other things instead because it seemed like it's a hard thing to go up against the coal industry and the whole academic establishment. So yeah.
My
Oh, I see.
goodness. I would love to talk to you more about that, Janet, especially the connection of labor. I think there can be a lot there. Um, and yeah, I don't I know it takes a lot of other resources, but the first book we had our book club with was self-published, and I don't know how much you've explored that route, but I know that she has done a lot of research on that and would be happy to connect you. I know it's not the same type of work, but um, I know that's a
Well, I'm not an academic anymore. I'm a popular educator. So yeah,
yeah.
I sort of took the turn after that. I said, I can't do this. I
Mm,
cannot go after that, you know, golden glittering prize when it doesn't really tell the truth in the way I want to.
wow. Yeah. Oh, so good to know you. And yeah, would love to talk to you more about that. Um, I I'd like to, wrap up with again this interview with that you did with Fred. And you asked him about his hopes for the future. And, he gave a long answer to what could have maybe been a short question, but I'm sure he did that with every question you asked. Um, but I really, really liked what he said. And he said, when I looked more deeply at my own life, I noticed that my life was not, nor had it ever been, built around hope. Laos was an example. I went there, I learned to love the peasants. The bombing shocked my psyche and soul to the core, and I responded, not because I was hopeful or hopeless, but because I was alive. And then at the end, he writes, on a good day, I have no hopes for the future, neither am I hopeless about it. I just wake up, work on opening to the forces of life, love, and energy, and do the best I can to experience life as deeply and fully as possible. That will always include doing my best to help others. So I really like
Hmm,
that. And,
very good.
not to say we shouldn't have hope, but I think that the feelings that we have about and the grief that we hold about what we've read and what we continue to see means that we're alive, and our desire to be a part of making it better is also, you know, something that we can do as a fellow human. So, um, wanted to end a little bit on a lighter note, and I know this book was, um, it's a dense, difficult read, but I hope that you continue to use it as a reference. I know I will. There's a lot that I underscored here that I hope to highlight more in our content, and just so grateful for your work, Mark. And I know that you are constantly looking for ways to amplify this book and support the work that we do and many others. So thank you so much. And thank you for your time today.
Oh, please. My pleasure. It was an honor speaking to your group. And
Good.
remember what I said about Carolyn Eisenberg's book.
Yes.
Carolyn Eisenberg shows that the anti-war movement made a difference. It tied the hands of policymakers, not fast enough, but it did have that effect. And it led to a lot of questioning that, as Noam Chomsky said, it opened a lot of people's minds. It led to a lot of questioning in a lot of areas, and that did make a difference. And uh, you know, it's it shows us what can be done, and we should try to continue. That's all. And if you're interested, the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, I put their website in the chat. They are, as we speak, organizing events along these lines, retrospectives on the anti-war movement, and discussions of the meaning of the U.S. and Indochina and related topics. So you might like to look at their website. So I'll stay in touch. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Mark,
Really
thank you so
appreciate
much.
you all.
Have a great night. Thank you.
Bye.